Rain pounds the streets of Brighton as Dr. Maya Thompson races toward the hospital, her pager screaming for urgency. The blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror aren't part of the plan. Neither is Officer Barrett's hand on his weapon, his eyes full of prejudice as he orders her out of the car. But what happens next will shake a city's foundations and force everyone to confront an uncomfortable truth about power, privilege, and the cost of bias. Dr. Abigail Washington smoothed down her white coat as she stepped out of Mercy General's main entrance. The late autumn wind whipped around her, carrying the scent of impending rain. Her 12-hour shift in the trauma unit had been grueling, but that wasn't what weighed on her mind. Tomorrow would mark her first year as Chief of Emergency Medicine, the first black woman to hold the position at Mercy General, and the anonymous notes had started appearing in her locker again. Just like med school, she muttered, pulling her coat tighter. The prestigious position hadn't come easily, and certain staff members still questioned her authority, albeit in whispers and sidelong glances. But Abby had learned long ago to let her work speak for itself. Her Tesla hummed to life as she approached. The car had been her one indulgence after the promotion, though her mother had warned her about driving while black in an expensive vehicle. Tonight, her mother's words would prove prophetic. The first drops of rain began to fall as she pulled onto Riverside Drive. Mercy General sat on the border between two worlds, the affluent East Side, where most of her colleagues lived, and the struggling West Side, where she'd chosen to stay, running a free clinic on weekends. She knew both worlds intimately, had walked the tightrope between them her entire career. The police cruiser appeared in her rearview mirror without warning, lights flashing. Abby checked her speed, perfectly legal, and signaled to pull over. Her hands moved to the familiar 10-2 position, years of conditioning taking over. Officer Richard Brennan had worked this beat for 25 years. He'd seen the neighborhood change, seen familiar faces replaced by newcomers who, in his mind, didn't belong. The Tesla had caught his attention immediately. It didn't fit his idea of what belonged on this street, especially at this hour. "License and registration," he demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. His flashlight beam swept over the car's interior, lingering on Abby's hospital ID badge. "Of course, officer," Abby replied calmly, though her heart raced. "My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for it now." "Step out of the vehicle first," Brennan ordered, his hand moving to rest on his holster. "Officer, I'm Dr. Washington, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Mercy General. I've just finished my shift and—" "I said step out of the vehicle," Brennan interrupted, his voice hard. "Now." The rain was falling steadily as Abby complied, water soaking through her white coat. She stood perfectly still, hands visible, as Brennan approached. "We've had reports of drug trafficking in this area," he said, eyes narrowing. "This vehicle matches a description." "Officer Brennan," she read his nameplate, keeping her voice steady. "You can verify my identity with the hospital. I'm heading home after a 12-hour shift in the trauma unit." "Hands on the vehicle," he ordered, ignoring her explanation. "Spread your legs." The humiliation burned worse than the cold rain. As she assumed the position, Abby thought of all her accomplishments. Her Harvard Medical School degree, her residency at Johns Hopkins, her published research, all meaningless in this moment to the man behind her. A second set of headlights approached, slowing as they passed. The car stopped, and Abby heard a door open. "Everything all right here, Rich?" a female voice called out. Detective Sarah Martinez had worked narcotics for 15 years before transferring to internal affairs. She'd known Brennan since her rookie days, had watched his attitude sour as the city changed around him. "Possible drug suspect," Brennan replied. "Vehicle matches?" "Dr. Washington?" Martinez interrupted, recognition in her voice. "From Mercy General?" Abby turned slightly. "Detective Martinez. We met at the city council meeting on emergency response protocols last month." Martinez's expression darkened as she took in the scene. "Officer Brennan, a word?" As the two officers spoke in hushed tones by the police cruiser, Abby remained where she was, rain running down her face. She thought of her father, who died waiting for an ambulance in a neighborhood where response times were notoriously slow. She thought of her mother, who'd worked double shifts as a nurse to put her through med school. She thought of her patients, of the lives she'd saved and lost, of the barriers she'd broken and those still standing. Martinez returned alone. "Dr. Washington, you're free to go. I apologize for the inconvenience." But as Abby reached for her car door, a call came over Martinez's radio. Multiple gunshot victims arriving at Mercy General's trauma unit. Critical condition. All hands needed. Abby's professional instincts took over. "I need to get back to the hospital." "I'll escort you," Martinez offered, shooting a glare at Brennan. The next hours were a blur of activity. 3 teenagers, caught in a drive-by shooting. As Abby worked to save them, she didn't notice Brennan standing in the ER waiting room, watching through the trauma bay windows as her hands moved with practiced precision, her commands clear and confident. He watched as she pronounced one boy dead at 3:47 a.m., her hand lingering on his forehead for just a moment before moving to the next patient. Watched as she refused to give up on the second boy when another doctor was ready to call it. Watched as she finally emerged at dawn, exhausted but successful. 2 lives saved against impossible odds. What Brennan didn't know yet was that one of those boys was his nephew, Marcus. Though he hadn't recognized the teenager through the trauma team's frantic efforts, he wouldn't make the connection until later that morning, when his sister's hysterical call would send him rushing back to the hospital. He also didn't know that this night would mark the beginning of a much larger story, one that would force both him and his city to confront deep-seated prejudices and long-held beliefs. But that reckoning was still to come, as were the events that would shake the foundations of both Mercy General and the police department. For now, Abby simply headed to her office to change her still damp clothes, unaware that her actions during this long night had set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about justice, forgiveness, and the possibility of real change. In her office, she found another anonymous note in her inbox, but this time, as she reached for it, her phone buzzed with an urgent message that would draw her into an even more complex situation, one that would eventually force both her and Officer Brennan to confront their preconceptions in ways neither could imagine. The message was from the hospital board chairman, marked urgent. As she opened it, thunder rolled outside, and the rain continued to fall on a city poised on the edge of transformation. The real story, the one that would test everyone's assumptions and beliefs, was just beginning. Detective Martinez, meanwhile, sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, tapping her fingers on her steering wheel as she considered what she'd witnessed. In her years with internal affairs, she'd seen patterns emerge, watched as small incidents snowballed into major controversies. Something told her this night would prove significant, though she couldn't yet know how right she would be. She pulled out her phone and began documenting the traffic stop, not knowing that this report would eventually become part of something much larger. The ripples from this seemingly routine incident would soon spread far beyond Mercy General's walls, touching lives and institutions across the city in ways no one could predict. Inside the hospital, Abby opened the chairman's message, her tired eyes widening as she read. The words on her screen would pull her into a situation that would make the night's events seem simple by comparison. But that was a challenge for tomorrow. For now, she leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath, gathering strength for whatever would come next. The storm outside intensified, rain pounding against her office window like a drum beat, nature's own soundtrack to the drama unfolding within the hospital's walls. In the ER waiting room, Officer Brennan continued his vigil, unaware that his next shift would bring him face to face with a truth that would shake his world to its core. The chairman's message was brief but alarming. Emergency board meeting, 9 a.m. Topic: anonymous allegations of preferential treatment in trauma cases. Your presence required. Abby's hand tightened on her phone. She knew immediately what this was about, or rather, who it was about. Dr. Philip Montgomery, her primary rival for the chief position, had been increasingly vocal about his concerns regarding her leadership, particularly her dedication to serving West Side patients. As she prepared to leave her office, a nurse knocked on her door. Dr. Washington, Officer Brennan is asking about one of the shooting victims. Says it's his nephew Marcus? The information hit Abby like a physical blow. She checked the patient charts again. Marcus Brennan, 16, multiple GSWs, currently stable in ICU. The same teenager she'd fought to save when others were ready to give up. Meanwhile, in the hospital cafeteria, Detective Martinez sat with her coffee, making calls. Each conversation revealed another layer to the story she was uncovering. Officer Brennan, it seemed, had a history of similar stops, but complaints had always mysteriously disappeared. Her investigation was starting to suggest a pattern of protected behavior within the department. As she dug deeper, Martinez discovered something else. Brennan's personnel file showed multiple commendations for drug busts in the West Side neighborhood, but also several unmarked disciplinary notes. The most recent one caught her attention. A complaint filed by a nurse at Mercy General, dated just 3 months ago. Upstairs in the ICU, Officer Brennan stood at his nephew's bedside, his world tilted on its axis. Marcus's mother, Brennan's sister Angela, sat beside her son, holding his hand. She hadn't stopped crying since she arrived. The doctor, Angela was saying, she wouldn't give up on him. Even when that other doctor said it was hopeless, she just kept working. She saved my baby, Rich. Brennan's throat tightened as he remembered how he'd treated that same doctor hours earlier. The memory sat like acid in his stomach. Dr. Montgomery chose that moment to enter the ICU, his tall frame casting a shadow across Marcus's bed. "Officer Brennan, a word about your nephew's case?" In the hallway, Montgomery's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "I feel I should inform you that Dr. Washington's treatment decisions last night were unusual, continuing resuscitation efforts beyond standard protocols, prioritizing certain patients over others. As acting head of the ethics committee, I have concerns." Brennan felt something cold settle in his chest. "Are you suggesting she did something wrong while saving my nephew's life?" "I'm suggesting that her judgment may be compromised by personal biases," Montgomery replied smoothly. "Perhaps influenced by the patient's demographics. The board is meeting this morning to discuss similar concerns." Before Brennan could respond, a commotion erupted at the ICU entrance. Another shooting victim was being rushed in, this time a police officer. The halls filled with blue uniforms as Brennan's colleagues arrived to support one of their own. Abby, heading to the board meeting, was intercepted by the trauma team. GSW to the chest, officer down, OR2 prepped and waiting. She glanced at her watch, 8:55 a.m. The board meeting would have to wait. As she rushed to scrub in, she passed Montgomery, who wore a slight smile as he headed toward the boardroom. What no one knew yet was that the wounded officer had been investigating the same drive-by shooting that had brought Marcus Brennan to the hospital. The connections between these events were about to draw everyone into a web of revelations that would change more than just hospital policy. Detective Martinez, watching the new drama unfold, received another call. The voice on the other end shared information that made her sit up straight, her coffee forgotten. The pattern she'd been tracking was bigger than she'd imagined, reaching into both the hospital administration and the police department's upper ranks. In OR2, Abby focused on her patient, bracketing out everything else. The wounded officer's life hung by a thread, requiring all her skill and concentration. She didn't know that, in the boardroom above, her absence was being noted and documented, another mark against her in a carefully constructed case. The storm outside had passed, but the tension within Mercy General's walls was building towards something bigger than any individual career or reputation. The truth about the drive-by shooting, the anonymous complaints, the years of systemic bias in both institutions. It was all connected in ways that would soon become clear. Officer Brennan watched the OR board status updates, his nephew sleeping behind him, his colleague fighting for life behind those doors. Dr. Montgomery's insinuations echoed in his mind, warring with the evidence of his own eyes, his sister's gratitude, his nephew's survival. The hands of the clock moved toward 9:30 a.m. as multiple stories converged, each person playing their part in a drama they didn't yet fully understand. In the boardroom, in the OR, in the ICU, and in Detective Martinez's growing case file, pieces were falling into place. But the real revelations, the ones that would shake both institutions to their foundations, were still to come. The storm had passed, but its aftermath would prove far more devastating than any rain. Martinez's phone buzzed again. This time, the message contained documents that would change everything. Evidence that linked the anonymous complaints against Dr. Washington to a larger conspiracy involving both hospital politics and police department corruption. But before she could act on this information, another crisis would force everyone's hands. At 10:15 a.m., Abby emerged from OR2, exhausted but successful. The wounded officer would survive, though his recovery would be long. As she wrote her post-op notes, her phone lit up with missed calls from the board meeting she'd missed. The hospital corridors were unusually tense. Staff members whispered in corners, conversations stopping when she passed. Something had happened during her surgery, but no one seemed willing to tell her what. Detective Martinez intercepted her before she could reach her office. "Dr. Washington, we need to talk, privately." Inside Abby's office, Martinez laid out a series of documents on the desk. "These just came in. Dr. Montgomery has been building a case against you for months, but it's not what you think. The complaints, the allegations, they're connected to something bigger." The documents revealed a pattern of discriminatory practices in both emergency response times and hospital resource allocation. More disturbing were the financial records showing millions in missing funds earmarked for West Side medical initiatives. "Montgomery is not just after your job," Martinez explained. "He's trying to prevent an audit. Your success rates with West Side patients are drawing too much attention to the disparity in care. They need you out before anyone starts asking the right questions. Meanwhile, in the ICU, Officer Brennan had made a disturbing discovery of his own. While talking with his nephew's friends who'd come to visit, he learned that Marcus had been trying to gather evidence about police harassment in their neighborhood. The drive-by shooting might not have been random at all. The wounded officer Abby had just saved was Detective James Chen, who'd been investigating corruption within the department, the same case Martinez had stumbled upon. Dr. Montgomery, unaware of these developments, was presenting his case to the hospital board. Dr. Washington's prioritization of certain patients raises serious ethical concern. Her emotional involvement with the West Side community compromises her judgment. But board member Dr. Sarah Chen, Detective Chen's wife, was asking uncomfortable questions. These complaint records seem irregular. Who verified these incidents? Before Montgomery could respond, his phone buzzed. The message made his face pale. We know about the missing funds. Clean house now. As tensions rose in the boardroom, Abby received an urgent page to the ER. A group of protesters had gathered outside the hospital, demanding answers about the disparities in emergency care. Local news vans were arriving, drawn by rumors of corruption and discrimination. Officer Brennan watched the growing crowd from Marcus's. His nephew's words echoed in his mind. Uncle Rich, they knew exactly who was in that car. They knew what we'd found. Detective Martinez was connecting more dots. The missing medical funds, the targeted shooting, the attempt to discredit Dr. Washington. They were all part of a sophisticated scheme to maintain the status quo on both sides of the city. In the hospital pharmacy, a nervous technician was shredding documents. In the police department's evidence room, files were being misplaced. But they didn't know about Martinez's copies, or about Marcus's hidden phone with its damning recordings. The protesters' chants grew louder. Equal care, equal justice. Abby stood in her office, looking out at the growing crowd. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Back off, or the next shooting won't miss. Down in the ICU, Detective Chen was waking up. His first words to his wife were urgent. The files, storage unit, proof. Dr. Montgomery's carefully constructed plan was unraveling, but he had one last card to play. He didn't know that Officer Brennan had overheard his earlier conversation, or that Brennan was beginning to understand his own role in perpetuating the systems that had nearly cost his nephew's life. The city's mayor was calling an emergency press conference. News helicopters circled overhead. Social media was exploding with footage of the protests. And in Abby's office, Detective Martinez was laying out a plan. We can expose it all, but the backlash will be severe. Are you ready for that? Before Abby could answer, her pager went off again. Another emergency, another life hanging in the balance. But this time, she knew that more than just one patient's fate rested on her decisions. The storm clouds were gathering again, both literally and figuratively. The city held its breath, unaware that the next few hours would change everything. Martinez's phone lit up with another message. This one contained video footage that would make maintaining the status quo impossible, but powerful people would do anything to keep it from seeing the light of day. The emergency that pulled Abby away turned out to be Dr. Montgomery himself, clutching his chest in the hospital parking lot. The irony wasn't lost on her as she worked to stabilize him, knowing he'd been actively working to destroy her career moments earlier. Stress-induced cardiac event, she announced to the trauma team. Get me a 12-lead ECG. As they rushed Montgomery to the cardiac unit, Detective Martinez was reviewing the video footage that had just arrived. It showed a late-night meeting between Montgomery, several police officials, and representatives from a private healthcare company. The conversation clearly detailed plans to redirect emergency resources away from the West Side, making way for profitable private facilities. Officer Brennan, still at his nephew's bedside, received a call from his precinct captain. Keep your mouth shut about the traffic stop. That's an order. But Brennan was watching Marcus sleep, remembering how close he'd come to losing him, not just to the shooting, but to his own prejudices that night. If he'd delayed Dr. Washington any longer, in the cardiac unit, Montgomery regained consciousness. His first words weren't about his condition, but a rasped warning to Abby. You have no idea what you're up against. Actually, Dr. Montgomery, she replied, checking his vitals, I've been up against it my entire career. The only difference now is that we have proof. The proof was spreading. Detective Chen's hidden files, Marcus's recordings, Martinez's investigation, pieces of a puzzle revealing systematic discrimination backed by corporate interests. But the stakes were rapidly escalating. Hospital security reported suspicious individuals in the parking garage. Police response times to the West Side suddenly doubled. Anonymous threats began arriving at Abi's office and home. The mayor's press conference was interrupted by breaking news. Federal investigators had arrived at both the hospital and police headquarters. But would they be allowed to do their jobs, or would political pressure shut down the investigation? Dr. Sarah Chen, still in the board meeting, received a text from her recovering husband. Trust no one in brass, evidence in Marcus's phone. The protesters outside had grown to hundreds, their chants echoing through the hospital corridors. Local community leaders were arriving, along with more media. The story was spiraling beyond anyone's control. In his ICU bed, Detective Chen was scribbling names on a notepad, his hands shaking with urgency. Officer Brennan watched from the doorway, recognizing too many of those names. Officers he'd worked with, commanders he'd trusted. Abby's mother called. Someone had broken into their family home. Nothing was taken, but her father's old medical journals, the ones that had inspired Abby to become a doctor, were torn to pieces. Martinez pulled hospital security footage, tracking the suspicious individuals in the garage. Their movements suggested military or law enforcement training. This wasn't just harassment, it was intimidation by professionals. The hospital board remained deadlocked, some members clearly nervous about the federal presence. Dr. Sarah Chen stood up. I move to suspend this hearing pending the criminal investigation. Montgomery's private phone kept buzzing in the cardiac unit. Abby glimpsed a message on its screen. Contain this now. Use whatever means necessary. Outside, the air grew thick with tension. Police in riot gear began arriving, forming lines opposite the protesters. Among them, Officer Brennan noticed faces he recognized from Montgomery's video, officers whose loyalty had been bought. Marcus was awake now, whispering to his mother about the recordings on his phone. Angela Brennan's face hardened as she listened. She turned to her brother. Rich, you need to decide which side of history you want to be on. Detective Martinez received word that similar scenes were playing out at hospitals across the country. Their local scandal had exposed a national web of healthcare discrimination and law enforcement complicity. The mayor was meeting with corporate lawyers. Federal agents were conducting simultaneous raids. Social media was flooded with personal stories of medical discrimination and police bias. And through it all, Abby kept working. Another trauma case arrived, then another. She treated each patient with the same dedication, knowing that every successful outcome strengthened her position against those who claimed she was unfit to lead. But the real confrontation was still building. The forces aligned against change weren't going to surrender quietly. As night approached again, the hospital became a fortress of competing interests and dangerous secrets. Martinez's phone buzzed with an encrypted message, files ready for release, awaiting your signal. The choice now wasn't just about careers or reputations, it was about fundamental change versus powerful resistance, and everyone involved would have to decide where they stood. A helicopter spotlight swept across the hospital windows as federal agents moved through the building. The night was far from over, and the most dangerous revelations were still to come. At midnight, the hospital's computer systems suddenly went dark. Backup generators kicked in for critical care units, but administrative systems remained offline. Someone was trying to erase evidence. They're getting desperate, Martinez muttered, watching IT specialists rush past. But she smiled, knowing the most crucial files were already safely duplicated and distributed to multiple federal agencies. In the cardiac unit, Montgomery's room was empty. He'd somehow disappeared, despite being under observation. Security cameras showed an unauthorized ambulance transfer, but no record of who ordered it. Abby worked through the chaos, moving between patients by flashlight when necessary. As she checked on Marcus, she found Officer Brennan standing guard outside his room, hand on his weapon. There's a lot of unusual movement in the hospital, he said quietly. People who don't belong here. Detective Chen, now strong enough to sit up, was recording a formal statement for Martinez. His voice was weak but determined as he detailed years of systematic corruption, coordinated traffic stops to delay minority patients, deliberate understaffing in certain neighborhoods, evidence tampering to protect guilty officers. The hospital board had reconvened in emergency session, this time with federal observers present. Dr. Sarah Chen presented documentation of questionable financial transfers stretching back decades. Outside, the standoff between protesters and police had reached a critical point, but something unexpected was happening. Officers were breaking ranks, removing their riot gear, some even joining the protesters. The thin blue line was cracking. Angela Brennan stood at a hospital window, watching the scene below. Your uncle's down there, she told Marcus, who sat propped up in his bed. He's finally choosing right. Officer Brennan had indeed joined the protesters, still in uniform. His presence encouraged other officers to do the same, creating a powerful image that news cameras captured and broadcast live. In the hospital's server room, IT specialists discovered sophisticated malware designed to selectively delete records. But the attack had triggered an automatic backup system that Abby had insisted on implementing months ago. Another decision that had been criticized as unnecessary by Montgomery. Martinez's phone lit up with alerts. Similar system attacks were hitting hospitals nationwide. The conspiracy was larger than anyone had imagined, involving healthcare corporations, insurance companies, and law enforcement agencies across multiple states. A group of nurses approached Abby with years of documented incidents, times when minority patients had been redirected to understaffed facilities, when crucial treatments had been delayed due to administrative issues, when complaints had mysteriously vanished. The hospital's chief of security, reviewing camera footage, identified several of the suspicious individuals as private military contractors. Their presence suggested involvement from even higher levels of power. Dr. Sarah Chen found a pattern in the financial records. Shell companies, offshore accounts, all leading back to a handful of powerful healthcare conglomerates. The same companies had been buying up properties on the west side, anticipating reduced property values once emergency services were cut. Marcus's phone contained more than just recordings. He'd collected hundreds of testimonials from neighborhood residents, documenting a pattern of coordinated harassment designed to drive people from their homes. The mayor called a midnight press conference, but his carefully prepared statement was interrupted by breaking news. Federal indictments were being unsealed, naming prominent figures in both the medical and law enforcement communities. In her office, Abby received another threat, but this one was different. It offered immunity, a promotion, a fresh start at any hospital in the country, if she would just see reason and back Montgomery's version of events. Detective Martinez, anticipating the offer, had recorded everything. The evidence pile was becoming an avalanche, too big to bury or ignore. But the night's most dangerous moments were still ahead. Those with the most to lose were cornered, and cornered predators are the most dangerous. The helicopter spotlight suddenly focused on the hospital's roof, where movement had been detected. Someone was attempting to reach the building's main communications array. In the ICU, Marcus's heart monitor began beeping erratically. Down in the pharmacy, inventory systems flagged unexpected discrepancies in certain critical medications. The storm that had been building was about to break, and no one inside Mercy General was truly prepared for what would happen next. The irregularity in Marcus's heart monitor wasn't an accident. Lab tests revealed traces of a medication that shouldn't have been in his system. Someone had tried to silence him permanently. Officer Brennan, returning from the protest, found Abby already at his nephew's bedside, administering the antidote. "They're targeting witnesses," Martinez said, rushing into the room. "Chen's been compromised too. Same drug." The pharmacy logs showed the medications had been accessed using Dr. Montgomery's credentials during his supposed ambulance transfer. But security footage showed he'd never actually left the building. The ambulance had been a diversion. "He's still here," Abby realized, "and he has access to everything." The hospital's layout had always been a maze of old and new wings, connected by a network of service corridors and underground tunnels dating back to its construction in the 1940s. The perfect hiding place for someone who knew the building's secrets. On the roof, federal agents found sophisticated signal jamming equipment installed recently. It explained the communications problems, but not the true purpose behind them. What were they trying to prevent from getting out? Or what were they waiting to receive? Detective Chen, fighting the effects of the drug, managed to whisper something to Martinez. The tunnels, weapons cache, private army, the pieces suddenly clicked. The hospital's underground network connected to old civil defense bunkers. The perfect staging area for an armed response, and the perfect place to hide evidence. Officer Brennan recalled years of rumors about certain areas of the hospital being off-limits, about late-night deliveries and unmarked vehicles. He'd dismissed them as conspiracy theories. Now, he wondered what else he'd chosen not to see. Abby's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Sublevel 3, East Junction, 1 hour, come alone, or the evidence dies with the witnesses. Martinez tracked the message's origin to somewhere in the hospital's old wing. "It's Montgomery. He's getting desperate." But something else was happening. Community members had formed a human chain around the hospital, protecting it from any attempt at forced entry. Among them were police officers, hospital staff, and patients who had experienced discrimination firsthand. Dr. Sarah Chen, reviewing more financial records, discovered payments to a private security firm specializing in crisis management. Their personnel were already in position throughout the facility, disguised as hospital staff. The federal agents realized they were facing a potential hostage situation involving hundreds of patients and staff. One wrong move could turn the hospital into a war zone. In his ICU bed, Marcus struggled to speak. The phone, there's more. The tunnels, they're moving something big, tonight. Angela Brennan, who'd worked as a cleaning supervisor years ago, remembered something. There's an old maintenance shaft, goes down to the sublevels. They sealed it off years ago, said it was for asbestos. But I saw lights down there last week. The hospital's architectural plans, pulled up on Martinez's laptop, showed extensive modifications to the sublevel structure. None of them officially document. The hidden spaces could hide an army. Or worse. Abby looked at her watch. 40 minutes until the meeting. Behind her, Marcus's vital signs had stabilized, but Chen was still critical. Throughout the hospital, she knew other potential witnesses lay vulnerable. The protests outside had swelled into the thousands. News helicopters circled despite federal requests to clear the airspace. Whatever was going to happen, it would have an audience. Martinez's phone lit up with satellite imagery. Heat signatures in the sublevel spaces suggested dozens of people moving with military precision. They were preparing for something. Officer Brennan checked his weapon, remembering his SWAT training from years ago. "You're not going down there alone, Dr. Washington." But Abby was already forming a different plan. Sometimes the best way to disarm a trap was to spring it on your own terms. The hospital's old pneumatic tube system, officially decommissioned but still partially functional, could move more than just medical samples. And Abby knew every inch of this hospital, including paths Montgomery might have forgotten existed. The hour approached as tension built throughout the facility. In the ICU, in the boardroom, in the hidden tunnels below, pieces were moving into place for a confrontation that would change everything. Thunder rolled overhead as another storm approached the city. But the real storm was already here, building in the depths beneath Mercy General. In the final minutes before the deadline, Abby put her plan into motion. Using the old pneumatic tube system, she distributed copies of all the evidence to every floor of the hospital. If anything happened to her or the witnesses, dozens of sealed tubes would be opened simultaneously, their contents impossible to contain. Officer Brennan positioned trusted officers at every stairwell and elevator, while Martinez coordinated with federal agents through encrypted channels. The hospital's regular security cameras went dark, but the hidden ones Martinez had installed days earlier kept recording. At exactly 1 hour, Abby stepped out of the elevator into sublevel 3. The emergency lights cast long shadows through the underground corridor. "I'm here, Dr. Montgomery," she called out. He emerged from the shadows, looking nothing like the polished administrator who'd tried to destroy her career. His tie was loose, his eyes wild. Behind him, armed men in tactical gear moved into position. "It didn't have to be this way," he said. "We had a system. It worked." "It worked for some," Abby replied, "but not for Marcus Brennan, not for Detective Chen, not for thousands of others." "You think exposing this will change anything?" Montgomery laughed bitterly. "The whole system is built on it. Even if you take us down, others will take our place." "Maybe," Abby agreed, "but change has to start somewhere." That's when the first explosion rocked the sublevel. Montgomery's people had rigged the tunnels to collapse, planning to bury the evidence and any witnesses forever. But they hadn't counted on Officer Brennan finding and disarming most of the charges. The few that did detonate created enough chaos for Montgomery's mercenaries to make their move. Gunfire erupted in the narrow corridor as federal agents emerged from hiding. Through the chaos, Abby noticed Montgomery slipping away toward a hidden exit. She followed, leaving the firefight behind, tracking him to the hospital's oldest section. They emerged in the original morgue, its antiquated equipment looming in the darkness. Montgomery held a hard drive in one hand, a gun in the other. "You don't understand what you're doing," he gasped. "The money, the power behind this. They'll kill everyone you care about." "People are already dying," Abby replied. "Every time a West Side ambulance is delayed. Every time care is denied. Every time someone like you decides certain lives matter less than others." Officer Brennan's voice echoed from the doorway. "Drop the weapon, Dr. Montgomery." Montgomery spun, raising his gun. Time seemed to slow as Brennan's finger tightened on his trigger. "Wait!" Abby stepped between them. "No more violence. Not here. Not in this place of healing." Montgomery's hand trembled. "You can't change human nature, Doctor." "No," she agreed, "but we can change ourselves, just like Officer Brennan did. just like your own heart will need to change if you want to survive what's coming. The gun lowered slowly. Behind Montgomery, Martinez and her agents moved in quietly. Above them, the hospital erupted in cheers as the news broke. Federal agents had seized documents from corporate offices across the country. The system of discrimination was being exposed at every level. In the following weeks, the story unfolded nationally. Hundreds of officers and medical administrators were indicted. Corporate executives faced federal charges. The hospital board was dissolved and reconstituted with community oversight. Marcus Brennan made a full recovery and became a vocal advocate for police reform. Officer Brennan retired from the force to work with his nephew, establishing a community liaison program between hospitals and law enforcement. Detective Chen's testimony led to nationwide investigations of similar corruption schemes. His wife, Dr. Sarah Chen, became the hospital's new board chairperson, overseeing sweeping changes in care policies. Detective Martinez was promoted to head a new civil rights division within the department, while Dr. Montgomery and his conspirators faced lengthy federal sentences. As for Dr. Abigail Washington, she kept doing what she'd always done, saving lives, breaking barriers, and proving that excellence knows no color. The anonymous notes stopped appearing in her locker, replaced by thank you cards from patients of all backgrounds. 1 year later, Abby stood in Mercy General's auditorium, addressing a new class of medical residents. Officer Brennan sat in the audience beside his nephew, now a pre-med student. Medicine teaches us that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken, she told them. It's about preventing the injury in the first place. The same is true for society's wounds. Change starts with acknowledging the hurt, understanding its causes, and committing to do better. Outside the hospital windows, the city had changed. Response times were equal across all neighborhoods. Joint training between police and medical staff was mandatory. Community oversight boards ensured accountability. But most importantly, people had changed. Like Officer Brennan, who'd confronted his own biases to become an agent of transformation. Like Dr. Montgomery, who eventually cooperated with prosecutors, understanding finally that healing required truth. The storm that had brought them all together had passed, leaving behind a foundation for real change. Not perfect, not complete, but growing stronger every day. As Abby finished her speech, she remembered the words her father had written in his old medical journal, the one that had been torn apart that night. The true measure of healing is not in the wounds we mend, but in the barriers we break, the bridges we build, and the lives we change, including our own. The next generation of healers rose to applaud her words, their faces reflecting the diversity of the city they would serve. Among them, she saw the future she'd fought for, one where excellence and compassion knew no bounds, where healing meant more than just medicine, and where change, though difficult, was always possible. The story of that rainy night became part of hospital lore, taught to every new hire and officer in training, but its true legacy lived in the daily choices of those who'd learned its lessons. In every fair traffic stop, every prompt response, every life saved without prejudice. And in her office, Abby kept the torn pieces of her father's journal, now carefully restored and framed. A reminder that sometimes the greatest healing comes from confronting our deepest wounds, and that change, though painful, brings its own kind of grace.